It's long been said there are lies, there are damn lies, and then there are statistics. Now, it's true that there are a lot of ways to do bad statistics. You can just intentionally run bad experiments. You can just misrepresent what the data actually is. It's also possible to use good statistics, i.e. mathematically correct statistics, but just through the representation of the data to create a misrepresentative narrative. And I'm going to show you some ways that that's often done today. So if you were to look, for example, at the price of gold from 2016 to the present, and this is currently early 2021, I'm making this video, it would look like gold is skyrocketing, that inflation is rampant. So you could certainly create that narrative by selecting that graph. However, if we were to zoom out a little bit, and you went from 2012 to 2021, you might actually see that at this exact moment in time, the price of gold has gone down over that 9-year period. So you'd be like, there's no inflation at all. It's actually gone down over the last 9 years. No worries whatsoever. If you were to zoom out a little further and go back to where the dollar was no longer pegged to the price of gold, i.e. the start of where inflation could have existed in gold and the dollar, well, that would be somewhere in the 1970s. And if you looked at that graph, you would see a very steep exponential function. So again, you'd be looking at a situation where there would be a lot of inflation. By taking this graph from different starting points, you can create massively different narratives. And so you can see the same graph used to argue the point that inflation is rampant and also the point that inflation doesn't exist. So be very, very careful that you read beyond the headlines, that you look at the actual graph in question, and maybe even do a little due diligence and look at other ways of representing this graph. If someone showed you a graph of the last 10 years, maybe go look online and see if you can find a graph of the last 30 years or the last 5 years. Now, you may say to me that that's still a case of bad statistics or being intentionally deceptive because someone's intentionally chosen to include certain data or leave out other data. But let me show you another way that you can manipulate a graph to change the narrative without changing the data represented at all. So let's say you have a stock, and that stock has increased by 5% in value. If you were to look at that chart of the stock's increase in value, and you were to set it to 0, you're going to set the bottom of the chart at 0, at a price of $0 for the stock, and the top at, a reasonable amount above its current price so that you can see a picture. Well, then you would see a chart that looks almost like a straight line. A 5% increase is not going to look like a big difference. It's going to look essentially flat. If, on the other hand, you were to zoom in that graph so that instead of it starting at 0, you chop it at, say, 90% of the current value and go to 110% of the current value, on that chart, it's going to look like a very steep increase. So that 5% gain in the price of the stock is going to look like a huge change, huge progress, like a lot of money has been made recently on that stock. And by just changing the axis, changing how much of the graph you show, you're showing a dramatically different narrative. The final example I want to share with you is one you don't see as much in the digital age as you used to see in the era of newspapers, but it is still seen and it is dramatically effective in terms of creating a false or misleading narrative. And that is using a graph based on pictograms. So when you use pictures instead of these traditional bar graphs, what you're doing is you're using something that has a scale to it in multiple dimensions. So when the height doubles, it goes 2x in terms of height, you're squaring that difference when you look at the overall area of the picture, right? So if one quantity is 2 times as big as another, the area of the picture represented by it will actually be 4 times as big. And so by selectively using pictures rather than bar graphs, if you're trying to show that one thing is drastically different than another, you're going to have a much more pronounced effect by representing it using those pictures. So what can you do with this information? Well, firstly, you can be more careful when you look at graphs and you look at data. When you see data represented, take an extra second and look at the axes. Look at the time horizons. Decide if you think that they are chosen appropriately. Did they choose an effective height range for the axes? Did they choose an effective time horizon that actually represents the phenomena that you're trying to explore with those statistics? Or did they choose a misleading time period that can lead to bad representation of the data? And then also, did they do manipulative tricks like the pictogram trick that I've discussed with you? So take a second, look at the graphs, and actually try and look at the underlying numbers as objectively as you can, rather than taking your first gut instinct with graphs as face value. And that's going to help you a lot in terms of understanding what's really going on with data representation, what's really going on with the world. However, even if you do that really well, you probably, to some extent, still may be manipulated. And to illustrate this point, I'm going to give you kind of a personal example. When I was playing poker professionally, I had a graph that would show my winnings over time. I took a lot of pride in that graph. I considered it kind of a personal goal to make that graph look good, because making that graph look good resulted in success, resulted in money, resulted in a lot of things for me. And so I cared what that graph looked like. I cared about a winning graph of my poker results. Now, when I would go through a bad run, when I had bad cards or being unlucky or maybe even playing badly at poker, that graph would turn downwards. And that would be very depressing to me. That would make me upset, at least a little bit. And it might make me question my play a little bit. But what I realized, because when you start playing emotionally in poker, you play worse, I was able to kind of self-brainwash by changing the time period of that graph. So let's say, for example, I'd had a bad week and I was feeling very bad. I was feeling like a losing player. Well, maybe I would change the display of my graph to display the last 6 months, and you could see that in the last 6 months, that week was just a blip and that was overall winning player, and I could have a little more confidence in my play again. Or sometimes what I'd do is if I had a really long losing stretch, I would just reset my graph and start it again from now and just kind of try and forget that that previous period had actually happened. And I was able to kind of brainwash myself, even though I knew exactly what was going on, even though I was aware of it. The very shape of that graph, the very fact that I could interpret the graph in a certain way would lead me to feel differently about the situation. So understand, even if you logically are aware of these things, you still may be psychologically influenced by them. And that just shows how powerful these manipulative techniques are and why it is that people are so ready to use them.